In our previous video, we covered how the English Civil War finally broke out after decades of build-up, ultimately leading to the conflict's first major pitched battle at Edgehill in October 1642. Many spectators and participants alike hoped this clash would end the conflict, but they were tragically mistaken, for the flawed generalship and heavy losses among King Charles I's Royalist army would lead to a deadlock that trapped the British Isles in bitter civil war for almost another 2 decades. Welcome to our third piece of the 17th century English Civil Wars, where we will explore the events surrounding Charles's march on London and the campaign of 1643, culminating at the First Battle of Newbury. We're also going to highlight a time when monarchs had a much tighter hold on unruly England through our sponsor Magellan TV, who brings you their series She-Wolves, England's Early Queens. It's a 3-part look at the stories of various times the usual kingly trend was bucked in favour of a queen between the 1100s and 1500s. While later on being a queen in England made you powerful and popular, in earlier days it made you a target. Women and power was an unthinkable combination for the warlords and nobles scheming over the throne. But when a woman does climb to the top of the No Girls Allowed club of English rulers, you know there's going to be an interesting story to tell, and Magellan does it beautifully in this recommended series. And there's loads of other great content on Magellan TV. They boast the richest and most varied history content available anywhere, covering everything from the ancient to modern eras, wars, biographies, and the Earth itself. Aside from history, they've got extensive collections of science, true crime, travel, and other documentaries. They add 15 or more hours of 4K high-definition content every week for their subscribers at no extra cost. It's all viewable anytime, anywhere, on televisions, laptops, mobile devices, and more. Get access to 3,500 hours of ad-free documentaries for only $4.99 a month, and get a month for free by subscribing to Magellan TV via our link in the description. Having suffered the first defeat of the war at Edgehill in 1642, the Earl of Essex's battered and demoralised parliamentary army retreated north to the safety of Warwick Castle. Meanwhile, jubilant at the news of his army's victory, and urged by his firebrand cavalry commander Prince Rupert, King Charles I ordered a measured advance towards London. He advanced via Banbury, which capitulated on October 26th, then took Oxford, the city which would become the Royalist cause's beating heart throughout the First War. While the main armies of both factions thrust and parried each other's blows near England's great capital city, the embers of conflict also burst into flames in the outlying counties. In the north, the Earl of Newcastle, Charles's appointed military governor in the region, assembled a small but disciplined army and faced off against the parliamentarian Lord Fairfax and his prodigious son and second-in-command Sir Thomas. Throughout the course of 1642, Newcastle gradually gained the upper hand in Yorkshire, pushing the anti-Cavalier forces back to Selby. He enjoyed such success that in December, the Earl even received royal thanks for his service. In the West Country, Royalist and parliamentary forces fought a small-scale war of raids and counter-raids near the Welsh border, a state of affairs that would continue well into 1643. In this theatre too, the king's men gained the upper hand. As the war on the periphery continued, the king's main army resumed its march on London after stopping at Reading to consolidate. However, this delay allowed Essex to overtake his opponent by moving via Northampton, reaching London before the Royalists got there. The armies clashed again on November 11th, when Royalist troops under Rupert caught and badly mauled 2 regiments of parliamentary horse near Brentford, a key staging point on the way to London. Much like they had at Edgehill, the Prince's victorious troops went too far instead of consolidating their position. This time, rather than simply taking Brentford as a prelude to moving on to London, his men looted it. While this plundering was gentle when compared to the ravages of the 30 Years' War on the continent, inhabitants of nearby towns began forming into a citizens' army, prepared to resist further attacks. When the Royalists approached the village of Turnham Green, only a few miles from London, they were opposed by a ragtag army of 24,000 parliamentarians, composed of men from the capital's trained bands, Essex's beaten army, and hastily armed civilians. Against this defensive bulwark, there was nothing Charles's army could do. The royalist host was already short of supplies and still depleted in numbers after Edgehill, and moreover, if the apparently imminent Battle of Turnham Green became a true battle, the killing of London's ordinary people, however armed they were, would likely turn the country against its king even more. So, after an incredibly tense standoff lasting almost all day, the royalist army turned and withdrew at dusk. This was a pivotal moment in the war, for the royalists had failed to retake the city, and its massive wealth, industry, ports and strategic value would remain a keystone of parliamentarian power. After this anticlimax, Charles dispersed his army to winter quarters in Oxford and the surrounding towns, where support for the king was most pronounced. Over that winter, the famous university city was transformed into an alternative military capital for the royalist cause. While the king's army put down roots for the cold season, Essex's still numerically superior force concluded the year by besieging and capturing Reading. After this, with disease and many other issues plaguing both armies, a stalemate set in. Essex wintered in the Thames Valley, where his army was dormant until the campaigning season of the next year. To further protect the capital, civilians began digging earthworks and other defences. By the turn of 1643, it was clear that any chance of a quick Cavalier victory had been snuffed out. The immediate concern for Charles was a lack of military resources, particularly gunpowder and match. His wife, Henrietta Maria, was in the process of ferrying hundreds of barrels of these, other supplies and money to Oxford from the Low Countries. However, until he received these critical munitions, the main royalist army was unable to undertake any proper offensives. Failure to capture any of the major port towns of the south meant that the Queen's convoy had to dock at the northern coastal town of Britlington, which was under Newcastle's control at the time. For the time being, a wedge of parliamentarian-held territory sat between the king and his much-needed supplies, a fact which made the Yorkshire Campaign of 1643 even more vital. While the Queen took residence in York, Newcastle fought the two Fairfaxes for supremacy over Yorkshire's valuable clothing towns. In an early spring campaign, it seemed as though the Royalists were going to maintain their hegemony in the north. On March 30th, one of Newcastle's subordinates, George Goring, soundly defeated the northern parliamentarians at Seacroft Moor near Leeds. Unwilling to be defeated so easily, the Fairfaxes got back at him in May. On the night of the 21st, Sir Thomas Fairfax stormed Wakefield in an excellently executed night assault and captured Goring in the process. The setback was a shock to Newcastle and meant that the Yorkshire Royalists were unable to spare any troops to assist their Queen's progress back to Oxford. A few weeks earlier, Essex had roused Parliament's main army in the Thames Valley and used it to besiege Reading, a vital link in the defensive line shielding Charles's makeshift capital at Oxford. Essex took the city on April 25th after a blockade lasting almost 2 weeks. Unfortunately for the Lord General, his overly cautious nature and a massive outbreak of typhus among his soldiers crippled the Roundhead army, threw away its strategic initiative, and gave royalist forces in the area much needed breathing room. On June 1st, Henrietta Maria left York, accompanied by 5,000 men, and despite being clearly sighted by Essex's scouts, was not intercepted. As the supply convoy slowly moved south, the northern campaign reached a climax when Newcastle's 10,000 men cornered and crushed Thomas Fairfax's 3,500 at Old Walton Moor, securing royalist control over Yorkshire and besieging the parliamentarians at Hull. Now free of pressure from the Thames Valley, Prince Rupert, victorious in many small raids and cavalry skirmishes, rode north to escort his queen the rest of the way. She finally entered Oxford on July 14th to rapturous applause and the ringing of bells. Everything was going the king's way, but the royalist summer hadn't peaked just yet. The main threat to Oxford in 1643 was Sir William Waller's newly formed Western Association Army, operating in and around the area of modern Wiltshire and the southwest, threatening to cut off Royalist communication with Wales, a key recruiting ground. He was opposed in the west by the brilliant Royalist commander Sir Ralph Hopton, an old friend and comrade of Waller's with whom he had fought in the 30 Years' War decades earlier. He was also a notorious disciplinarian, touting the firm but fair motto, "Pay well, command well, hang well." After initial setbacks in the west against Waller's forces, Hopton rallied his men and defeated his rival in a near-run battle at Lansdowne Hill in early July. However, the wheel of fortune turned quickly. When the Cavalier commander inspected prisoners from the battle, he was injured by an exploding powder magazine and temporarily put out of action. Waller took advantage of the chaos and almost trapped Hopton in the countryside, but his men just managed to retreat to Devizes, where they were besieged. After then, receiving reinforcements from Oxford, Charles's armies concluded affairs in the west at the conclusive Battle of Roundway Down. Once again, the Royalist advantage in horsemen paid off, and their mounted charge shattered the parliamentary line. Many terrified and fleeing Roundhead cavalry charged by accident down a hidden 300-foot drop, known since as the Bloody Ditch. With that, the Western Association army was utterly crushed. When news subsequently arrived in Oxford that their enemy's Western army had been totally annihilated, Charles dispatched Prince Rupert with 5,500 troops to reinforce Hopton's army. This opportunistic campaign probably intended to take Gloucester, but Waller's retreat to the city bolstered its defences, making that objective unrealistic. So instead, the Royalist field army headed for Bristol, England's second most populated city. It also possessed key metalworking industries, which could be turned to the creation of weaponry, and a small fleet which had potential as the beginnings of a reborn navy. Rupert, whose very name was half a conquest, reached Bristol unopposed on July 23rd. 3 days later, his forces stormed the city's outer defences and managed to capture one of its gates. Realising his cause was hopeless, Parliamentary Governor Nathaniel Fiennes surrendered soon after. The capitulation was a coup for the Royalist forces in both morale and material. Around 80 guns were seized, along with 1,700 barrels of gunpowder and 6,000 muskets. But the manpower cost had been a high one. As many as 500 Royalists were killed in the attack. With the gathered momentum, a Royalist War Council convened on August 4th and agreed that the next target would be Gloucester itself. With a population of 5,000, it controlled the Severn River and communications from Oxford to South Wales. By the 10th, Royalist armies completely surrounded the city, but instead of the surrender of its governor, Edward Massey, they were met with fierce resistance. Now facing an extensive siege, Charles's siege commander, the Earl of Forth, began a bombardment on the 13th. When news arrived of Gloucester's situation, total alarm struck Parliament due to fear that its loss might mean total collapse. To remedy the situation, Essex's main army near London was swiftly reinforced with an influx of fresh troops and the trained bands of the city proper. At about this time, Edward Montague, Earl of Manchester, was given command of the newly formed Eastern Association Parliamentarian Army. He appointed an almost unknown cavalry commander, a certain Oliver Cromwell, as his second in command. On August 25th, Essex's enlarged main army managed to save the beleaguered parliamentarian bastion in the west. Despite suffering multiple Royalist attempts to hinder his army's progress, Essex reached Prestbury Hill, from which he could see the spires of Gloucester's great cathedral on September 5th. From there, the Thames army fired off a number of cannons to alert the city garrison that relief was close at hand. On the same day, Charles's almost months-long investment of Gloucester came to an end with total failure, his army withdrawing to Bristol. Nevertheless, Essex's now vulnerable position provided the Royalists with a great opportunity to win the war anyway. The presence of London's trained bands in the field army meant that if the Cavaliers could bring Essex to battle and defeat him, a significant part of the capital's defenders would be lost with the army's destruction. Realising the danger, the Lord General tried to trick his Cavalier opponents by moving up to Tewkesbury, feinting as if he was either going to march in a wide arc back to London using the northern route, or intended to invade Wales. When his ruse failed, Essex boldly made a run for safety via the southern route on September 15th. He almost succeeded, but Prince Rupert's scouts detected the movement, caught up with the parliamentarians via a more direct route, and savaged their dangerously overextended army at Oldbourne Chase. This forced Essex to delay his march, and allowed Charles's army to overtake his own. The Royalists occupied the town of Newbury on the gloomy afternoon of September 19th, thereby putting themselves in a superior position between London and Essex, forcing the latter to rest on high ground south of Enbourne village. Defying his usually cautious nature and unwilling to stay on the back foot, the Earl of Essex roused his army, composed of 8,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, just before dawn. The general rallied his vanguard, asked whether they were willing to fight, and was met with the reply, "Let us fall upon them. We will, by God's assistance, beat it from them all." With that, Essex led his vanguard of 4,000 infantry and a small number of mounted men out at 6 AM towards the strategic height of Round Hill. The Royalist forces hadn't properly reconnoitred the battlefield, and thus hadn't realised the escarpment's importance. So with relative ease, the parliamentarians took the defensible position. The Cavalier army, made up of 7,000 infantry and a formidable 7,500 cavalry, began filing out of Newbury a few hours after the parliamentarians assembled. While the main force organised itself, the energetic Prince Rupert rode out with 900 musketeers and some cavalry to take Round Hill himself. However, he was shocked to discover that the strategic high point was strongly defended by around 2,500 parliamentarian soldiers, whose presence blocked the Royalists. Realising he couldn't make progress with his current strength, Rupert left the infantry under Colonel George Lissell and rode back to Newbury. News of Round Hill's capture by the Roundheads alarmed the Cavalier leadership, but a swiftly organised war council quickly decided what the objectives and deployment for the day would be. With their plans finalised, Charles I's Royalist army began deploying on a north-south axis in 3 main sections. A relatively small number of troops, under William Vavasour's overall command, were stationed on the right wing, in the enclosed Kennet River Valley. In the centre, attacking Round Hill, were placed Sir Nicholas and John Byron. Prince Rupert and the majority of Royalist cavalry arrayed on an open area called Wash Common on the left, closer to the Enbourne River. England's second Stuart king raised his royal banner on a hill in the northern Kennet Valley area of the battlefield. It was on this front that the day's first action took place, provoked by parliamentarian artillery fire raining down from Round Hill. Vavasour's royal regiments advanced in the valley's enclosed terrain and amidst dense hedgerows, moving forward on land which was far better suited for defence rather than attack. After a brief, terse clash on this northern flank, the Royalist foot was easily blunted, with heavy losses. However, sensing an opportunity, the triumphant parliamentarian foot launched an attack of their own. This thrust gained some ground, and managed to unbalance Vavasour's ranks, but the intervention of Charles's Lifeguard cavalry blocked it. For the remainder of September 20th, both sides avoided closing with one another on the northern front. On the approaches to Round Hill, the 2 Byrons and their respective infantry and cavalry units advanced up the slope in an attempt to dislodge the parliamentarians on top. However, their march was spotted, and they were met with fierce resistance from ranks of musketeers and emplaced culverins. During the vicious fighting which broke out on the hill, an intellectual and anti-war aristocrat known as Lord Falkland, who fought for the Royalists, was killed by a musket ball. Soon after, Cavalier horsemen managed to rout a section of the parliamentarian centre and were close to securing Round Hill. However, professional officers in Essex's reserve saw the danger, plugged the gap, and used disciplined volley fire from muskets to repel the horsemen. The king's forces were stuck in a stalemate here as well. As brutal close-quarters fighting was taking place on Round Hill, Prince Rupert was busy organising 6,000 royalist horses on Wash Common. When the first line of cavalry was ready, it charged into Sir Philip Stapleton's Parliamentarian horse, who hadn't fully formed up on the opposite side of the common. Stapleton managed to put together a defence in time, using new delayed close-range volley tactics to drive the royalist cavalry back twice. However, amidst the crack of carbines and clang of poleaxes on plate, Prince Rupert managed to turn the Parliamentarian cavalry's flank on the third charge, driving them back to Skinner's Green Lane. In the afternoon, reserve units of the London trained bands strode into the breach on Wash Common left by the cavalry, repulsing a probing charge by Rupert's horse. Instead, the Royalists resorted to a massive artillery barrage aimed at breaking the final Parliamentarian ranks. However, the supposedly inferior trained bands, who had no cover on the open plain, defied all expectations and stood stalwartly, maintaining their formation for many hours, even in the face of massed but inaccurate culverin fire. Nevertheless, this constant shelling eventually weakened the gallant Parliamentarian reserves. When Prince Rupert then led a thunderous mounted charge across the common's northern sector at around 4 p.m, Essex's trained bands began to break, tearing open his line and threatening to scythe the entire army in two. At precisely that moment, the Earl of Essex bravely galloped onto the scene, riding among his retreating troops and inspiring them to turn around and fight. In one account, a cannonball is said to have landed only a yard from the Lord General, but his personal intervention was necessary. The trained bands, particularly their red and blue units, turned around and charged at the Royalists, reforming their formation and stabilising the front. After some subsequent lighter combat, both armies began disengaging at 7 p.m, after a ruthless 14-hour stalemate. Charles's forces retreated all the way to Newbury, where they stayed the night and conferred about what to do. The next morning, the Royalists chose to not re-engage, either because of depleted gunpowder supplies or because the High Command simply lost its nerve. Both armies lost about the same number of troops at 1,300 each, and even though Rupert had come close to victory, Essex escaped back to London in the aftermath. Newbury was just as tactically inconclusive as Edge Hill had been the year before. Nevertheless, the battle would have far-reaching consequences. Although the King's armies were dominant in every theatre as 1643 came to an end, Parliamentarian allies in the far north were about to change the nature of the entire war. The Royalist summer had ended. Our series on the English Civil War will continue, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.